With that, though, I'd like to open to some questions from the floor if colleagues have questions or comments. Unfortunately, we don't have a roaming mic, so please project. But I see one hand here already, so please, sir, at the back.
Sorry, my name is Michael Ewing. I'm the coordinator of the Environmental Pillar in Ireland, which is a coalition of environmental NGOs. I have three sort of questions all related. The first one is in relation to comparability. And obviously, Ireland is a country within the European Union. And are we able, through your mechanisms, to compare with other EU states, the 15 or the 27 or 28? And the other one then is, in terms of getting data from other sources, will you be interested, or will you have your mechanisms thought about for taking in crowdsourcing of data, or at least data from outside of the normal sources? Thank you.
Thank you. So I might take a couple of questions collectively, please.
Yeah, I'm Chen Li from UNFPA. I have a question for UNSD. So my question is, how you transfer our condition, normalize the local data national level to the global? So what I want to do is like a map worldwide. I see the property or poverty. When I zoom in, I see more detailed, regardless of one country or cross country. Not just country by country compare, but if I cross the border, I'll see the village kind of thing compare between country. So the basic question is how you normalize the data you collect by different countries.
Please.
Hi, my name is Mauricio Saavedra from UNFPA, and my question is for our CSO. And do you have the data of what the government is doing in those districts? For instance, when you have in Dublin, those places that have more poverty, what programs are there, and things like that. So your story is a full story. It would be interesting to have that.
And just one final question this round for gender balance, I think, please.
It's Vivian from UNFPA. My question is more about, you have all those indicators mapped. Sometimes to tell the story, the relationship with different data set can be reflected by the map. My second question is more about, you have such a good information display and how the private sector benefits from it. I think the life will continue to move if the private sector sees it very useful, and in what way if you have any information.
Thank you. I think that's plenty to get us started with. I'll hand over to Kevin if you want to start with maybe crowdsourcing and address some of the other comments as well.
Okay, so crowdsourcing. Okay, so cold hard statistician, I have to look at the information. The information has to be authoritative and repeatable. We haven't gone down there yet because, as Greg said, we're only a year in this particular game and we've come quite far. Certainly the next phase is to look at crowdsourcing and so forth. But in terms of the crowdsourcing, if it is in environmental, yet again, we'd be relying on our colleagues from the EPA to steer us in the direction, because that's not those particular crowdsources. We're not experts in that, and therefore we're going to be looking for some people to help us in an interagency approach, and certainly in crowdsourcing in that area with the EPA, that will be coming. We'd have to bring on board along that. But certainly our scope is open. We haven't closed the scope yet. As I said, we've moved quite quickly and got a lot of information up in 12 months or so, so we're pretty much happy with that. In terms of, someone was asking about the policies that are coming along. We have the information on those story maps. Those story maps are statistical story maps. We've talked to the data. Yet again, we would be engaging with the relevant government departments. So if they have policies that they would like to be included in the story maps, and through the senior officials group that the DCCAE actually have responsibility for, and we are invited members, we've actually pitched this to the people who are there. We've asked them if they would like to work with us and produce a story map, but if there's policy aspects to it, they have to feed that particular piece to us. We're CSO, we don't make policy. So we particularly are very clear on our role in this side of things. In terms of the private sector, in my presentation, and I didn't finish it because it would have gone too long. When we started in May of last year, halfway through our project, which was around August, we had technology ready. So as an exemplar, we produced a open site for our census people. That's why we got so much great. So it was a feedback and a give back saying, thank you very much for your data, it's really good. From that site, we're clearly aware that our IDA, the International Development Agency, have used that to link to private sector for foreign direct investment. So we were delighted when we heard that. So the work that we have done has been repackaged and reused in a private sector environment. In terms of the private sector, they are not in scope in terms of discussion yet, but they're not out of scope. We just haven't got there. So we apologise that people have lots of ideas, but as you can imagine, we can only move phase by phase. Greg was here, and one thing he didn't mention as well is that we get great support from Greg and also the Esri community. We have quarterly meetings or so where we can discuss issues with story maps or the interoperability of how we use the site and how you can download and so forth. So there's a lot of discussion going on, and then we try to crystallize it in something, and that something is our web portal and the information that we can supply in it. Are we providing all the information we should? No, but we're doing it best we can, as we catch information and we verify it, most especially that's repeatable, we'll actually put it up on our site. The biggest difficulty for me as a statistician is that if people have data and that data is quite sensitive to change, it means the trends will rocket up and down year on year. Policy people will not take that information because they need steady information that can be used and reused, and timelines and trends can be understood. Thank you. I think I answered it all.
I think that got quite a few of them. And Greg, there were some questions for you.
Lots of questions, very good questions. A couple of points, just picking up from Kevin, where we are 1 year into this, and so the fact that we even called it a research exercise was because it was an experiment. Another point too is that we see now through the HLPF, we see voluntary national reviews. Why do we have voluntary national reviews? We have that so that countries can demonstrate the progress and the change that they're making. What we do not have the ability to do yet is bring all of those national reviews together and look what countries are doing individually into a global perspective. And this is where we have our global reporting, which is a required mandate, but how do we make that work from the national comparability? So coming back to the question around, say, from country to country and normalisation. So first rule of thumb is the data is the data. It is real data. So it's data that's been used from census or administrative data or registers or household surveys or other information. And then there's environmental data and others that fit with that. But it's data, and it's located to some level in an administrative area or something like that. Why I say that is that it is captured at different time steps in different countries. Some countries do a census every 5 years, some do it every 10 years. Some will have registers that are updated every 3 months or quarterly. There'll be trade data or other data that's updated on different time steps, and every country is different. So comparability on, say, a poverty index on an annual basis will be variable across countries because of the mechanisms they have to bring that reporting to the table. But in saying that, we, in the global perspective, we are basically the aggregator. UNSD is required to bring all of that national data together into a global database. One of the deliberate actions of this exercise was to not compare across countries or look at normalizing across countries. And so what we have from the global hub is that if you wanted to say go down into Ireland, you then go into Ireland. If you wanted to go down into Senegal or to the Philippines or to Mexico, you are going into their data hubs. This is where we have the system of systems. They're starting to join up. But what we're doing is transferring from a global perspective into those national perspectives. What we haven't been able to do yet, obviously, is look at regional differences or perspectives, and we only got 15 to 16 countries at the moment. And this is where things will need to change over the years. But at the end of the day, that's going to be a momentum that we need from the member states for this to be realised. The enablers are here. We have wonderful partners through the community and technology with Esri and others. But it really comes down to countries having, first of all, the data and then the capability and capacity to bring this to bear. And we know it can happen. We had an example recently with one of our partner countries, where they literally brought their data to real world viewing in a story map in 3 days. But their data was really, really well conditioned. They had just completed a census using modern technologies and tablets and GPS coordinates, etc. But if you've still got data that's coming from charts or tables and graphs, these things, it makes it a lot more difficult in terms of getting some of that data right.
Thank you. I see a couple of more questions here. Please.
I'm Frank Geary from the Irish Development Education Association. My question is actually inspired by your quote from E.M. Forster, who also famously said, "Only connect, live in fragments no longer," which I think could be a good description for the SDGs in some way and the interconnections between them. So the question I would have is, how can you use this data to really focus on those interconnections between the goals and to help develop policies for those?
Please.
My name is Harry Chen. I work with UNSD. So I've seen your presentation. I'm a follower of. Thanks for the fantastic platform. I started to follow in March when you were presenting it right before the SPAC commission. So I mean, I was in one of the VNR lab on Monday evening when you were presenting some of the challenges you faced when you were trying to work with other partners. So I thought those are really great experiences that lesson learned. It could be shared with other countries who would like to go the same way. So there are plans to put, like how do you conquer challenge? It's specific in working with other partners, and how do you manage to convince them to have them on board? And all these lesson learned experiences I thought would be really valuable for other countries to follow. It's really a congratulations, a fantastic platform.
So, where do we go from here in that case? If we have a lessons learned countries to follow, how do we do that? How do we rise to that challenge, and how also then do we address that fragmentation issue?
Partially addressed. I've been at an where I presented. Yet again, it's about the portal. So what we're trying to do is grab people's attention on certainly about our project. So I see us as an example of what you can do. In terms of the next stage, I know the UNSD, I've been discussing with different people there, are particularly around that, how we're going to do it. So I think that it's about getting the correct venue and the correct audience, I would think, and then Ireland is open to presenting it. I share today that we work very closely in Ireland with all the stakeholders, and the governance is a big thing, but not everybody likes governance because there's a responsibility and determinations, and someone has to put their names to something, so people don't particularly like that. But certainly going forward, I think that certainly from discussing issues with some just general discussions, no formal discussions yet, your point around the lessons learned is something that we actually should do and share. The issue is the audience. Most likely what we'll do is a story map being what we'll do on it, and we'll try to share that, and then hopefully through UNSD that they can circulate that through. But it's our goal in Ireland to produce a story map around it'll be the story so far in terms of SDGs for Ireland, and we'll bring as much information as we can. But a lot of it is, as Greg has said, is that I mean I'm driven to do it. So the answer no just doesn't happen. I mean, we just have to do it. So as part of my job, I see it as corporate support. I have to look across all of the information about the technology, look at the data, look at the source and so forth, look at those pieces of a jigsaw, and then put it into a picture. So that was the key piece that actually comes along on that, and we've been trying to share that information in a general way, but certainly from what we're going to go is produce a story map on lessons learned, and hopefully that then will be circulated, something like the VNR that we've had here, and that should help people to actually do that.
Thanks. And just before we move to Greg for some additional comments, I just want to also introduce my colleague Les Carberry from Department of Climate, who's representing the Minister who hasn't been able to stay with us. But Les, would you like to add a couple of words on the Department's involvement and how the Department of Climate, as our lead agency for the SDGs, has been working with CSO to map this?
Thanks, Orla, and good morning, everyone. I suppose I really just wanted to jump in to kind of, first of all, emphasise the point that the Minister made about right across government in Ireland, the fact that the CSO produces such reliable data and we never have to question it, we can just take it for granted that the data that the CSO produces is going to be accurate is hugely helpful for policymakers. But beyond just the accuracy, again across the entirety of government, the independence of the CSO as an organisation is both recognised and incredibly valued. And I think it's a tribute to the way that Kevin has gone about this project, that he has set up from day one governance structures that allowed the CSO and us as policymakers to come together and each contribute, us maybe providing the policy narrative, Kevin providing the medium and the data, but each being able to respect each other's roles and there being complete clarity that Kevin has the data, goes with the data, is led. He is not going to be commenting on policy, and nor equally would we be saying anything about which data should or should not be used. So that's been an incredibly productive relationship. And also, Kevin, you said you see yourself as a supporter, and you've certainly been very supportive. But I mean, I know the department very much sees your team and the CSO in general as a partner, and so it's been a great process. Just on some of the questions, and maybe it's the question, Frank, that you asked about the kind of interconnections. I think some of that will have to come from the policy side, in that, again, providing that narrative of showing how different policies in different sectors interact, and then possibly Kevin can kind of layer data from a number of different indicators. I think we do need to go cautiously on that, because the only concern that we would have is that we never want to say that correlation implies causation, and just because a policy is there and the data has shifted one way, either for good or bad, there's sometimes a wider story, and we need to take account of that as well. So, but again, working with Kevin, we've always been able to find a way of making sure that both the data and the policy has been presented in the best way that's informative and accurate. So yeah, just again, thanks so much for the work you're doing.
I didn't have a lot else to add. One of the things, though, I guess with these sorts of systems, particularly when you look at geographic information systems, is that you can start doing a lot of analytical work on comparing different types of data. And I think that's the journey, or the opportunity that we have with some of this in the future. And by that I mean where we take data about people and start looking at it in comparison with data on the environment, and what that means in terms of quality of water, potable water, or river systems, or drinking water, air quality, all these other sorts of indicators that are treated to a certain degree in isolation, but have the ability to come together to start thinking about cause and effect. And certainly, as the Minister mentioned in his opening, when they think about asthma in Ireland, in many other countries, when you think about disease and the needs for vaccinations and some of the causes around that, particularly in developing countries, there's obviously trends that are not often connected, and these information systems have the ability to bring those connections together. And I think that's going to be a missing link that will come together in the future with the SDGs.
Kevin?
Yeah, just to follow up on that. Okay, so we're not clapping ourselves on the back here, but just to tell you that from CSO, okay, we've been able to use some of our surveys and census data in terms of transport, both road freight transport and private transport, to look at the origin and destination for carbon dioxide. So we're able to model it. So we have a map up on it where you can look at that, where you can see the origin and the destination. And when some of it is from census, you can go zoom all the way down into the EV. So probably like Manhattan here or New York, you start off quite far away, and then you donate all your carbon dioxide on the way into Manhattan, and then you go donate it all the way back as you come through. So this is the ability to do it with the data, especially in the visualization of the actual data. So we can actually do that. So the idea is that we would work with our EPA people. We'll say, okay, we can see an opportunity for you from our data, and then we move into that space. And yet again, it's a support role. They're the definitive organization for that information, but anything that we can see, we can actually support on it. So, and that's an example of the agencies working together, because suddenly we, for the first time, we're into their space and we're bringing our approach to life, which is statistics and so forth, into it, and see can we reuse the information, which is, it's already there, but can we actually reuse it? And we've been quite successful on actually doing that, and that's where certainly on the environmental side, the issue in terms of asthma and so forth, there's mortality, which is the deaths, and then there's morbidity, which is the instances of illness. We actually have asthma. We actually have it. We have the instance of asthma, and we have it up on a map, so you can actually you can see it. You can see those instances. They're there. So yet again, we only inform policy. We don't make it, but we're empowering the policy people by putting that information there. Also, in terms of we produced the first food loss index. We worked with one of our local universities, Cork Institute of Technology, to produce a food index. So we have a food loss index for Ireland. The first one, I think, that's been provided at this level in the world. So that's one of the 12 gold 12s. So, but that's because we have this interagency working collaboration, and hopefully that's the message that we're getting across, is that you now have access to statisticians. It doesn't matter who you are, you have access to us. And we're just interested in data, and if we can see the data and we can see the reuse of the data and then the dissemination of the data, everybody's getting very much a win-win on that side of things. Thank you.
Okay, I see a couple more questions. We just go through them very briefly, perhaps, before we wrap up. So the lady here.
My name is Deirdre Carlin. I'm with World Vision Ireland. So firstly, just to say congratulations on your innovative work in the Central Statistics Office. It is really great that Ireland is part of this project, and I certainly look forward to as it grows and the scope and ambition increases. So my question is on data disaggregation. So when we talk of leave no one behind and reaching the furthest first, it is so important that we count those marginalised groups, and that our data does show what it means broken down by women and children, young people, by those living with disability, traveller groups, migrant communities, and a whole other range. So what are the plans in the Central Statistics Office to really break that data down, taking in mind those specific groups?
Thank you. I'm Eva Little from ICOMOS International Council on Governments and Sites, and I noticed you mentioned the tiers, that the tier 1 indicators were the ones that you prefer to work on in the first phase, and that reminds one of how there are always 17 goals and the targets and their indicators. They may not be at the same level of data availability, and how actually every country's existing statistical infrastructure is actually geared toward the indicators. Was there a task of translating the existing system into the indicator system of the SDGs? And do you have, in Ireland, did you notice any unevenness that you needed to address in terms of all the types of data being available at the same level, and how this also translates to different countries? I hope that was clear.
Okay. Thank you. I know we're coming close to time, so I see 2 more questions here at the back. So please.
Enda Murphy from UCD. Again, I'd like to congratulate the CSO. I think this is a really fantastic innovation, and my question is around data as well. So if we look at Ireland's recent VNR, it's based mostly on Eurostat indicators, but not all the Eurostat indicators overlap with the UN indicator set. So I suppose my question is, will Ireland be trying to also get data for the UN indicator set as well as the Eurostat data, so that we're part of global reporting as well as also undertaking the national reviews as well? Thanks.
And the very final question from...
Thanks. Stephen Potter from Global Affairs Canada. Thanks for a very interesting presentation. Many of the questions have focused on the data side of the equation, but I'm interested in the story side. How do you keep that story up to date and aligned to the story that the data are telling?
Thank you. Well, that's probably more questions than we had at first. I think just for context, I guess, before I hand over to answer the substantive questions, the 2030 agenda, as many of you know, is co-facilitated by Ireland and Kenya. Our former ambassador, Ambassador Donoghue, is here with us today, and large parts of that agenda were written in this room. So we're very pleased to be now a few years on, looking at how we capture that. I'll let the hard questions on how we do capture that be answered by Kevin and Greg.
Okay, so the first part on the tiers. Okay, so some tier 3s are tier 1s in Ireland. Okay, so there's a flexibility about the tiers, depending on, so for some some tier 3s is just that, there may not be, reasonable methodology or good data, but in somewhere like in Ireland, we might have good methodology and good data, so that obviously promotes itself up to it. And the tiers are the IAEG SDGs. They determine the tier levels on stuff like that. So there's a flexibility around that. So the tiers are reflected for the majority of member states, not a specific set of the majority of member states. That's where those tiers actually come from. In terms of small, maybe disadvantaged disability groups, they're all in scope, just haven't got there yet. But you have to remember, I'm CSO. Statistical disclosure control is rule number 1 for me. So if we're looking at geospatial aspects to it, I can't produce information on low-level populations, certainly at a geospatial aspect, because I will identify you. Okay, so that's the first thing that always comes to mind to me when I'm looking at the small population groups, especially if they're centered in particular areas, because then you're going to expose the data. We're CSO, we don't do that. We have a reputation of not doing that, and it's a clear that when you're looking at geospatial, it increases the risk of disclosure control, so we actually can't do that. In terms of the EU, now I've engaged with the EU since probably June of last year, with very little return from them. Okay, they're on a path to produce SDGs. So in my presentation, I introduced the fact that we had UN and EU, and we moved to national one. So our goal is on our site is to have the UN and the EU, and to get the EU ones in the same form that we have the UN with the geospatial aspect and so forth of it. So that's our goal to get. But quite a number of their data pieces are just at national level. So they're quite boring in terms of the geospatial aspect to it. But yet again, all of the set that we have supplied to the DCCA, Les and his team, in other words, that will come up on it. But it's just a table. And we're working towards how you engage with with our users in terms of a table. I think that's probably it. Okay.
Okay, thank you very much. I know we're tight for time in the sense that lots of us are across the road at 10 o'clock. But just before, as we're wrapping up, just to say a huge thank you to our panelists, a huge thank you to all of our audience. I think this whole idea of how we measure what we treasure is really, really important. The crazy, chaotic, multicolored mosaic of the SDGs does reflect the reality of our lives, and how that can be captured in a way that's meaningful and that we can measure how we're getting towards 2030 is incredibly important. A couple of tiny housekeeping announcements before we let you go. This is the last day of the HLPF, but Ireland is still co-sponsoring 2 further side events, one at lunchtime today with UN volunteers in room 3, where we are looking at the power of the volunteer, 1 billion volunteers in the world. So if you want to be 1 in a billion, please come along to it. And perhaps more of interest to this audience, late in the afternoon at 6:30 in Trusteeship Chamber, we're working with UCD, IMF and a number of other partners on digital governance and capturing a lot of the work I think reflected here as well. Very finally, SDG 12, SDG 2, zero hunger, sustainable consumption. I think we still have some pastries and coffee. We have a zero food waste policy here, so please feel free to help yourselves on the way out. Our colleagues will be happy to answer any questions and mingle for a while longer, and happy Mandela Day. Thank you.